We think that in order to make a portrait, we have to be able to do a portrait right from the beginning. Don't try to make finished art. Treat the beginning of the process as exercises. Again, like if you want to go out and you want to run a marathon, you don't run 26 miles a day. That's, first of all, they'll be picking you up off the road. You go out and you run a couple of miles, and you do that for a few weeks and let your body get used to it. And then you go and you do a couple more, right? You go from 2 miles up to, say, 5 miles. You run 5 miles for a few weeks and get settled in. Move that up to 7 or 10 if you're feeling good, right? There are things, you don't just jump into a marathon. You'd have to be insane. And nobody in their right mind would believe that, if you're sitting around, watching football games and eating potato chips and drinking beer every Sunday, that you're going out and running a 26-mile marathon. That's insane. And nobody would try that. Yet they'll jump into a portrait completely unprepared, with no idea of how to tackle it. And then be like, I don't know why I failed. I'm not talented. Well, try to do a triathlon like that, right? You wouldn't think anything. You'd be like, well, I haven't worked out in 4 years. I know why I only got a quarter of a mile down the road before I stopped. But you wouldn't beat yourself up over it. You'd just be like, well, I know I wasn't prepared. I didn't have enough practice or experience. Well, same with art. Nobody's born able to do this. These skills are earned, and you earn them in small increments. Let's say the contour has one here, right? The shadow here, down the nose, across the nose, and then down this way, and then across the top lip this way. We're talking about maybe from here to here, that contour, maybe about 10 to 12 directional shifts. If you took 10 minutes for each one, 10 minutes, a lot of time to figure out a single mark here. 10 minutes for each one. And let's say there were 10 of them. That would be less than an hour and a half, right? No, it would be 10 minutes more than an hour and a half, right? And you would have now, all you'd have to do is block in the light on the other side, and you would have a solid head. You would have basically the structure of the head in place. 15, 20 minutes to make gradients, and now you've got a three-dimensional head. No details necessary. And I would say for a student, stop there. Don't paint eyes, don't paint noses or mouths. Stop there. Take the victory. Come back and do another one like that. Change the light a little bit. Take your time and perfect that. You do that, you'll find that after a while, you can do it with blazing speed, because it is simple. You learn what to look for. You learn to not see the details, to ignore them, even though they're screaming at you. I'm an eye, paint me, right? You want to try to avoid that way of thinking. Big brushes, one shadow shade, one light shade. Put the two things together. Don't do the lights and the shadows at once, just the shadows. Figure out the shape. And then don't worry about the shadowed side of the face. You put the shadow in, the contour going down here, and then just paint away from it. Don't establish an edge on the other side of the face. You'll only establish the edge on the lit side. And you can use the same shadow shade and just put it on the other side of the face to establish your background. And what you're going to see is that you do a dozen of those, you'll start to see how simple a portrait is. Once you have that, rendering in details into it is not that hard. Right? If I have a shadow in this eye socket, the eye fits in that eye socket. How big is the eye? Right? It takes up a third of the height of the eye socket. Well, that's not too hard to figure out if you take time to look at it. It's half the width of the eye socket, or whatever the shape is that you're putting in there, how the width of the shadow and everything. The eye is a percentage left to right. It's closer to the inside or it's closer to the outside. It's lower or it's higher in the height of the shadow, right? And so you start breaking down that shadow shape into the placement of the eye. And again, keep it simple. Don't try to render a perfect eye. Just try to get the shape. Simple, a little bit of white on the eye on each side. And that's it, that's enough. You slowly, incrementally build up those base skills until you can do them without breaking a sweat. Recognize the subject and not really have details. And once you can do that, throwing details in on top of it is easy. People think details are the hard part. The truth is the structure is the hard part. Getting the volume into that face, getting the form. I recommend for students who are interested, for people who are interested in playing with this, Work in grayscale. One shadow shade, one light shade. Work in grayscale. It eliminates the nightmare of trying to match flesh tones. Once you can do it and you can fly through grayscale portraits, then create a single color for a light and a single color for a shadow. And now paint them a monochrome portrait that way. It's exactly the same, except for instead of being gray, it's going to be a color. And even if the color is green, it doesn't really matter. Whatever. But if you try to mix a flesh tones are easy enough, generic flesh tones. So you just play around with a color, you mix the light, then you mix one for the shadow. And again, it's exactly the same thing. Block in the shape of the contour of the shadow, pull away from it, and then block in the light, and then turn the form with gradients. But again, the idea is simplicity is key. Don't try to make a finished portrait. Develop the first stage. Get good at it. Get really good so that you've got confidence. When you start the second stage, the first stage isn't a concern. You knock that out without even breaking a sweat. Now you're stepping into the second stage to learn how to manage that. And again, let the portrait take time. Let it develop. You bite off more than you can chew, you're going to fail. And it's going to chip away at your confidence. Part of being able to do this is having confidence in yourself. And so when you start small, start simple. Build some confidence that, hey, every time I do this now, I'm able to do it, right? Again, if you're going to run, you run 2 miles and the first day you're like, oh, that's terrible. By the end of 2 weeks, you're like, it's not so bad. Treat the art the same way. Do this simple exercise like I just described, and it's going to be a mess for the first couple of weeks. But as you're doing it, they're going to get better and better, and eventually you'll be able to actually get a recognizable head consistently. Now, there's no details in it, but you'll be able to create a 3-dimensional head in grayscale that is recognizable. They'll start by being semi-recognizable, and eventually you'll make sense of it. And I don't mean years, weeks. It doesn't take that long if you're not biting off too much. But once you've got that and you've got that confidence, you're like, the first stage, I can nail this. It's never a problem. Now I can go to the next step. And don't go for a finished portrait. Go for something a little bit more refined. So after you've got the shadows and the lights and the gradients, add a little bit of something in the shadows. Maybe slightly darker notation for the eye or for a nostril. Define the mouth a little bit. Don't render details. Again, big brushes. And then do that for a little while. And you'll see that actually improves the quality. Maybe you put a highlight on the light side of things. Just a highlight is going to dramatically change the 3-dimensional nature of the painting. So just put in a highlight. One value. Goes on the forehead, maybe on the cheek, maybe on the nose, maybe a little in here, right? You just kind of drop them in, and that's the next step. Slightly darker in the shadow in a couple places, slightly lighter to put in highlights in the lights, and stop there and do that until you're killing it. Then go to the next step, and the next step will present itself. It'll tell you what it is.
That's such a good point. We don't learn anything else like we think we should learn art, right? We just kind of assume that we should be able to create portraits and we just jump right in, but we don't do that with anything else. And Carmen actually asks a really good question here for technically when you're doing this. She asks, is it better to practice using the same face over and over again, or do you think it's a better idea to kind of mix things up?
So it's actually a great question. If you can use the same face over and over until you figure it out, that's great. And look, you can even do it from a photograph. Like, don't trace it. Put it up on the wall 2 feet away. It doesn't move, right? If you have a live sitter, it moves. But while you're practicing and figuring out the technique, get a photograph. There's lots of photographs out there. I mean, even shoot it yourself on your phone, right? Then it's not that hard to do. You don't have to have a large image, nice little image, and just, work on that. You do it over and over until you figure it out, right? Because you're going to run into problems and it's not going to work the first time. But you're going to realize, oh, well, this doesn't look right. Okay, so next time you paint it, pay attention to that area. This other stuff you seem to get, but this piece didn't work. Let me pay a little bit more attention when I do that. Once you've got one face down, then move to another. And look, I wouldn't try to finish the portrait like doing all the stages. Do one face until you've maybe 3, 4, 5 times. Because again, they're going to be relatively quick. You do it a few times until you've got that overall structure with the 2 values, sharp edges and gradients. Once that's done, then find a new face, and then find a new face. You can play around with it, doing it from life, But I recommend, at least to start, doing it from a photograph. Don't stick with the photographs too long. You want to kind of bounce back and forth, because you'll feel like you were dropped in ice water if you go from doing nothing but photographs for a long time and then trying to do it from life. You'll feel like you don't know what you're doing, like you can't make sense of it, because you're now viewing three-dimensional subject matter and having to translate it down to 2 dimensions for the painting, where the photograph's already been translated. But the photograph's going to make it easier to see those contours between the shadows and the lights.
So from there, where would you suggest people go? So let's say they've watched this video and they've committed to doing this how you've laid it out. They're going to start with grayscale, really, really big, bold strokes, and just work until they're accurate and they're really, really focused on this. How can students and people who kind of want to make portraiture a career, what are the next steps from that? How can they continue to improve their portrait painting as they go?
Well, look, I mean, this is learning to observe is really the key, right? You can't paint what you can't see. Now, I was talking earlier about people's entire education being painting what they see. At some point, you have to be able to see stuff to be able to paint it. But that requires an education in how to filter the information, right? And that's basically what we do with Evolve. We teach you how to filter visual information, to simplify it at the times that it needs to be simple, and to break down the complexity through a process, so that each part of the process addresses different aspects of the complexity of the image. So you're not tackling all of it at one time, right? I always equate it to juggling, right? If you have the opportunity to juggle, like, would you rather, like, I was going to give you $1 million if you could juggle, and I give you the choice to juggle 1 ball at a time or 3 at a time. Which one are you going to do if you want to win the $1 million? You're going to juggle 1 ball. That's easy. 3 balls requires real skill. And even if you know what you're doing, there's a chance you're going to miss and drop something, right? And so a good process, a good program, a way of going about painting only lets you juggle, or teaches you how to juggle just 1 ball at a time. Finish with that one and put it down, then pick up the next one. To not juggle all 3 at once, to not squeeze all of the information into one stage. Break it up into stages that build one on top of another, so that you're not drowning in so much information. And again, as you become more and more experienced, you can juggle more than 1 ball at a time. But the thing is, when you're first learning, simplicity is key. Simplicity in how you think and how you filter that information. And that's why I say, start in grayscale. If you can't do it in grayscale, you can't do it in color. Don't even bother. If you can't make a painting work in grayscale, color is going to murder you. It's just going to run over you. Perfect it in grayscale. It may not feel like you're doing anything spectacular, but once you got it down and you move it over to color, you'll realize you can do it in color too. If you try to do it in color, you're not even going to be able to get the values right. So perfect it in grayscale first, always. And any education that starts in color is garbage. I mean, I firmly believe that. Firmly believe it. All educations in art should be started in grayscale, because it eliminates what I would assert is the most complex aspect of painting, which is color mixing. And that thing, I mean, I've been at this 30 years and I'm still just scratching the surface of it. I mean, it's just every time I open a door, there's like 10 doors behind it. At this point, at this rate, the way the doors are multiplying, I'm never going to get through it all. But grayscale is very straightforward. It allows you to concentrate on 2 very simple things: the values, which you establish right at the beginning, and then the edges that connect them.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point, because even when I'm working in color, I learn something with every single painting. There's just more and more you can kind of dig into with color. And if that's where you're starting, that's incredibly overwhelming. There's just no
frustrating, isn't it?
So frustrating. And I see so many people trying to learn how to paint in color and they've never done anything before. And I can imagine it's frustrating and difficult. So yeah, start in grayscale and really with those broad strokes like you pointed out.